She stood at the edge of my pasture, like she was addressing a press conference, one hand on her hip, the other clutching her phone. "Yes, I need an officer out here immediately," she said loud enough for the cattle to hear. "A property owner has illegally tampered with community utilities." I was the property owner. I stood about 20 yards away, boots planted in dry grass, hands resting in my pockets. The late afternoon wind moved through the fence line, steady and indifferent. I listened as she described me. Height, build, refusing compliance. She demanded someone come arrest me. The dispatcher on the other end of that line works for my department. I let her finish. Let her commit to every word. When she finally lowered the phone, I walked closer, slow and unhurried. "Mom," I said evenly, "you just called me." She blinked. To understand why she dialed 911 in the first place, you have to understand that water line. My family has owned this ranch for 40 years. My father bought it when it was nothing but scrub and stubborn clay, and he spent the next decade turning it into something that could outlast him. He installed the well system himself, dug the trench, set the casing, poured the pad around the pump housing with his own hands. I was 12 when he first let me help. By 14, I could repair a fence line and read a water table map without guessing. Land teaches you patience. It also teaches you boundaries. I'm not anti-community. When the subdivision went up along my north fence 5 years ago, I didn't fight it. Progress comes whether you like it or not. I kept to myself, paid my taxes, followed county code, answered questions when neighbors asked. For context, I've been county sheriff for 6 years. That's not a flex. It just means I understand paperwork and jurisdiction better than most. When the developers broke ground, they asked for temporary access to my well during construction. Temporary. What most people forgot is that temporary comes with an end date. She'd been elected HOA President the year after the last developer moved out. Before that, she'd managed a regional office for a logistics company. You could hear it in the way she spoke. Bullet points, policies, decisive pauses. She loved procedure, loved meetings, loved the weight of a gavel more than the sound it made. At first, the letters were minor. Fence alignment, pasture visibility from the cul-de-sac, suggestions about aesthetic harmony along my north boundary. I filed them where they belonged and kept fixing fence posts the way I always had. Then a certified envelope showed up. It stated I had illegally obstructed shared water infrastructure. Shared, that word did most of the work. She claimed the irrigation spur feeding their decorative retention pond crossed my land and therefore fell under association control. It did cross my land. What she didn't know, what she never bothered to confirm, was who actually owned the valve that controlled it. And that's where this stopped being about landscaping. The certified letter was followed by another. Then another. The language sharpened each time. First, it was a compliance reminder. Then a formal notice of violation. After that, the fines began. $50 a day for obstructing shared infrastructure. A week later, it doubled to $100. The final paragraph mentioned the possibility of a lien if the balance remained unpaid. I responded once in writing. Calm. Direct. I requested copies of any recorded easements, maintenance agreements, or utility plats granting the HOA authority over infrastructure on my parcel. I asked for the document numbers and filing dates. Nothing came back. Instead, one morning I found a laminated notice zip-tied to my front gate. It stated the HOA would be entering the property to store access if I failed to comply. That was the moment I walked to the well house and turned the auxiliary valve clockwise until it seated. I didn't touch county water. I didn't disrupt a single residential tap. I shut off a spur line branching from my private well, one that fed nothing but their decorative retention pond. By evening, an email went out to the entire subdivision accusing me of interfering with community resources. My phone started ringing. That's when she decided to make it criminal. She showed up 2 days later with backup, 2 board members and a 3-ring binder thick enough to suggest confidence. They stopped at my gate like it was a property line in Lanapudipoyum. "We'll be filing criminal charges for utility tampering," she said, flipping the binder open without looking at me. "This is now a law enforcement matter." Already was, I told her evenly. "That line sits entirely inside my parcel boundary." She adjusted her glasses. "The developer intended shared use. Intent isn't law. Recorded documents are." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply repeated that if they had a filed easement, I'd review it. The next morning, a formal notice arrived, stating the HOA board had voted to authorize legal action and emergency intervention to restore water flow. That afternoon, she dialed 911. That was the point of no return. The moment she shifted this from a civil disagreement into a criminal accusation, she expected deputies. She forgot to check who signs their evaluations. What she didn't know was that a year before any of this started, I'd commissioned an updated boundary survey when the subdivision went in. I've learned not to rely on assumptions when new neighbors arrive with heavy equipment. The sealed survey sat in my safe. It showed, in clean lines and recorded references, that there was no easement granting water access across my parcel. No shared utility covenant. The only document tied to that spur line was a 24-month temporary construction rider signed by the original developer. It had expired 3 years earlier. I also kept printed emails from county planning confirming the developer never converted that temporary access into a permanent, recorded utility easement before turning control over to the HOA. I didn't send her copies when she first demanded compliance. I waited. Because it's one thing to make a mistake. It's another for formally assert authority you don't have. Strategic patience only works if someone overcommits. And now she had made a recorded 911 complaint. When dispatch notified me of the call, I did what I'd expect any sheriff to do. I stepped back and let protocol run. A patrol deputy responded. Body camera on. Report number assigned. Clean chain of documentation. I stayed by the fence while she delivered her version. "He sabotaged community infrastructure," she said, gesturing toward the well house like it was a crime scene. "He shut off water that belongs to this association." The deputy listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked one question. "Mom, do you have a recorded easement granting the HOA access to that utility line?" The wind moved through the pasture again. She flipped through her binder. Paper shifted. No answer. I handed the deputy a copy of the updated survey. Then the temporary construction rider with the expiration date highlighted. Then the email from county planning confirming no permanent easement had ever been filed. She pivoted quickly. "There's historical usage. That establishes rights." The deputy explained, calmly, the difference between a civil dispute and criminal tampering. Usage wasn't the same as recorded authority. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. He also reminded her that knowingly filing a false criminal complaint carries consequences. She grew sharper, more insistent. I said less. But I wasn't finished, because the fines were still on record. The next HOA meeting was held in the subdivision clubhouse, a square room with folding chairs and a projector, humming against the far wall. I went in boots and a button-down, not a uniform. This wasn't a law enforcement matter anymore. It was governance. She called the meeting to order with the same clipped confidence. Midway through the agenda, she introduced a motion to proceed with a lien for unpaid utility interference fines. I raised my hand. When she recognized me, I stood and asked for the floor. My voice carried without effort. I started with the recorded plat maps, projected onto the screen behind her. Parcel boundaries, utility corridors, nothing crossing my land except what belonged there. Then I displayed the temporary construction rider, the expiration date centered in red. After that, the email from county planning confirming no easement had ever been filed by the developer or the HOA. Murmurs started low, then spread. Finally, I read from a printed transcript of the 911 call. Public record. Her words describing criminal tampering. The room grew still. Board members began exchanging looks. A few homeowners leaned forward, reading the screen for themselves. Dues had funded attorney consultations. over a line the association didn't legally control. Then I clarified something important. If the HOA entered my property to manipulate a private wellhead without a recorded easement, that exposure wasn't theoretical. It was trespass, potentially more, and assessing fines without documented authority opened the door to selective enforcement claims. Not dramatic, just expensive. I didn't threaten. I didn't posture. I simply explained the sequence of risk. Silence settled over the room heavier than any argument. When I finished, I made one request: written confirmation that all assessed fines would be rescinded and that no lien would be filed against my property. The vote was called. 4 hands went up in favor, 1 against. She kept her hand raised alone. Within a week, the fines were formally withdrawn. I received a signed letter from the board acknowledging there was no recorded easement, granting the HOA access to my well or the spur line. Their attorney circulated an advisory limiting future enforcement actions to documented authority only. Quiet language. Careful tone. The decorative pond went dry for a while. A month later, drilling equipment showed up near the clubhouse. They pulled permits, filed plans, and installed their own properly permitted well. It cost them more than my original cooperation would have, but it was theirs. I didn't turn anything back on, because nothing had ever been owed. One evening, I walked past the original well housing my father installed. The paint is worn now. The concrete pad has hairline cracks from summers and frost. I ran my hand across the pipe, casing the way he used to, checking for vibration, listening for pressure. This was never about a pond. It was about precedent, about what happens when procedure starts pretending it's ownership. Power isn't volume. Authority isn't assumption. And sometimes the most effective response is letting someone fully commit to a mistake on a recorded line. She called 911 to have me arrested. What she did instead was remind the entire subdivision exactly where the property line stands.